you've delineated a number of scenarios for Syria, for the future of Syria. Walk us through what is the future of Syria?
Sure, and keep in mind, that a lot of things can be true at the same time, but a policymaker has to decide which of those truths should drive their decision making. So you look at what's going on in Syria. Clearly, there's a humanitarian dimension to it, and when this all began, you had Democrats versus autocrats, and boy, if that's the scenario, certain courses of action are suggested to you. And then it quickly became clear that in addition to being that, it was also sectarian, with about 60% of the population, the Sunnis, against the 11% of the population who are Alawite, and the Christians and the Druze and the Kurds kind of on the sidelines. And boy, somebody in America at this point in time, when you tell them it's a sectarian war, there's a little bit of a different instinct on the course of action compared to a humanitarian crisis. And then it became very clear, by the way, all these are still true, right? The third scenario is that this is a proxy war between Sunnis and Shia, and with the Iranians and the Saudis being the primary actors. And that kind of suggests to you, well, maybe we should hang back. And then the fourth scenario, also true, is that the Syrian revolution has been hijacked by Islamist extremists, by al-Qaeda. They've become the controlling element in the opposition, and left unchecked, what we could end up with was a pre-9/11 Afghanistan-like state comprised of Anbar province and the eastern Syrian desert. And unlike Afghanistan, not in the middle of nowhere, but in the middle of the Middle East, and 100 and 150 miles from major urban centers, Damascus and Beirut and Jerusalem. I now think that one, the one I just described for you, although all the other ones are still true, that's the controlling one when it comes to devising American Western policy there.
So what we have is the following. We have what began as a democratic revolution against an autocrat, turn, in your view, into a sectarian conflict.
Yes.
Perhaps by proxy.
Yes.
What is then the solution as far as America is concerned for Syria?
Well, right now the ideal solution is to have made different decisions 2 and 3 years ago, to put a Western, even American, thumb on the scale to affect the evolution of the conflict.
And America didn't.
We did not. No.
It held back.
It did. It
did not intervene when it could have, in some form or another.
It did not intervene when intervention carried less of a tariff, carried less of a bill. To put our thumb on the scale now would require remarkable energy on our part to have that change the battlefield balance in any way.
It didn't even interfere diplomatically and politically and strategically. I'm not speaking militarily.
No, I understand. And the folks across the park from us, behind us here, would probably argue with that point. And I could probably find some instances where America did try to engage politically and diplomatically. But frankly, if you don't back up those kinds of actions with realities on the ground, I think your influence is quite weak, and ours was. And let me add an additional thought. Is this evolution, from autocrats and Democrats to sectarian to proxy to an al-Qaeda-like takeover, as that evolution took place and these new truths became apparent, it was the great misfortune of my country to have that last truth become so apparent in the summer of 2012, which, as you know, is right in the middle of our presidential election year, and very few bold decisions are made in those kinds of years.
Do you mean this was politics? Cynical calculations?
Not cynical, it's just very hard for Americans to turn their attention, the administration to turn its attention to that kind of issue, to make that kind of high-risk decision in the midst of a political season.
General,
here.
When tens of thousands of people die, and people then take the expedient road to politics, that is cynical.
Well, I wouldn't attach cynicism to it. It's just much harder to do. And by the way, Marwan, I understand there are a lot of people dying, but it's not just my country's humanitarian responsibility here. There are many other countries.
Well, let me tell you,
that.
We're going to get to that. Let me tell you what Syrian opposition leaders that I spoke to recently think. They think there is a certain cynical calculus at play, whereby the opposition is supported just enough to stay alive, but not enough to be able to fight seriously the regime.
I would agree with you that that is the effect of current actions collectively, including my own governments. That is the result, and that's a very dark statement. I really don't think that's the intent. But I do think it's clear that's the result. And look, there are some
But all the signs show that it is the intent.
Well, I know.
I mean, we're not judging intentions, but
no.
the signs are such. You are an intelligence man,
Right.
and you look at the facts.
Right.
The facts are that throughout the last 2.5 years, this administration has, for good reasons or bad, for politics or others, have stayed on the sidelines and watched Syrians getting slaughtered.
Right. No, they have. But even if we had done this, like I said, my first wish is, can we run the clock back 2 years when this was more shapeable, more influenceable? Even then, and I've actually written about this during that time period, even then, a Western American intervention into this conflict was not a high probability shot. Success was not guaranteed at that point.
Well,
so I understand some reluctance.
When you say Assad needs to go, Assad lost all credibility? When the President of the United States says that?
I carry no brief to defend that. That's correct. When the President says that and then doesn't act, number one, it doesn't just affect the Syrian battlefield. It affects the American position in a whole variety of questions.
Well, let's talk about
around
that.
the world.
With Syria, staying with Syria. It seems to me that the cynicism, as far as many Syrians and Arabs are concerned, goes even deeper. They would that this administration would like to see al-Qaeda and the Syrian regime going after each other. Why not? They're both unfriendly to the United States. Let them kill one another and let the Syrians fall between the chairs.
To have Sunni extremists battling with Shia extremists in a fight to the death, in a way that consumes their energy so that they are not focused on other potential enemies or targets, in a very practical, real politics sort of way, is probably not the worst of all possible worlds.
So you actually think that Assad is fighting al-Qaeda, and that serves America's interests?
Except that what I've just described for you as a policy goal is a morally unacceptable outcome.
Morally unacceptable.
Yes.
And that's okay then for this president who said, we cannot have our short-term interests overcome our long-term values.
Well, I cannot read my president's mind. He makes decisions. He is very reluctant to get involved. As I said, success was not guaranteed even with robust Western or
But there was no
American
attempt at
involvement.
trying to. Okay, let's
That's
talk
quite
about
clear.
Let's talk about this another thing. The presumed, the expected attack on the Syrian military installations after chemical attacks were carried to fulfill a promise that said there's red line you cannot cross.
Yeah.
You served in the administrations before. What happened? Why didn't the president attack?
I think, again, during a political season here in the United States, the president felt a bit vulnerable politically because of his inaction in Syria. And he took a rhetorical move to, what I would say, secure his right flank, and laid out that although he wasn't acting robustly at that moment, there were some things that would make him act more robustly. One of those would be the use of chemical weapons. He said that. Marwan, it appears that those were not prepared talking points. He appears to have surprised many members of his staff when he said it, but he did say it.
And you were reluctantly supportive of that attack.
Oh, no. Having been involved in 2 sectarian conflicts in the last 10 years of my military career, and remember the reality, it's still a sectarian conflict. I mean, all those truths remain. I saw the dangers of getting involved, but I also realized the dangers of the President of the United States setting something as a red line and then having that red line crossed without consequences.
Well,
by the way, that's a very narrow American interest point of view. That has to do with my country and its role in the broader world.
We're going to talk about the broader aspect of it, but General, it seems to me that as far as you're concerned, it seems, and as far as this president is concerned, it's safer with Assad than it is with the alternative.
Well, look, looking at the range of possible outcomes, I mean, what are the potential results of the battlefield conflict? Absent now, what would be required is a massive external intervention to change battlefield reality. So if you put that aside, and I think that's incredibly unlikely, if you put that aside, I must reluctantly conclude that of the possible outcomes, Assad winning is not the worst one.
And that's what the president thinks?
I don't
This
know.
administration?
I don't know that. Although I will add that one of the American negotiating positions as we roll up to Geneva II, which we may want to talk about because I don't have much hope for it, but one of the American positions with regard to Geneva II is that much of the regime does survive. We have seen the results of what happens when a regime collapses in Iraq and in Libya. Very bad. And so this may be the government without Assad being the American position.
General, there's a lot of qualifying statements there. The basic point is that you and apparently this administration think that the person who is morally and politically responsible for the death of tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people should remain in power because that's in America's best interest. That's what you're saying.
Let me restate what I said and not impute it to the administration. They'll have to speak for themselves. Of the range of possible outcomes I see, this situation is so dark, so bad, so much the product of our inaction months and years before, that I reluctantly have to say I can think of worse outcomes than this regime staying in control.
Okay. Practically speaking, how could a regime that killed hundreds of thousands of people of his own, bombard his own cities, stay in power? How is that even possible?
Well, I mean, in terms of real politics
In
and
terms
real,
of real politics,
and real
how is that
power,
possible?
it happens all the time.
You think he will go on and govern?
It happened with his father.
No, his
after
father
Hama.
attacked one city.
Right.
But here we have, he lost control of 60% of his country. Yeah. The entire country is up in arms, hundreds of thousands of armed people, and there are hundreds of thousands of dead and few millions of refugees. Yeah. How could he take back control of the country?
Marwan, simply what I'm saying is, unless the West, the United States, outside powers are willing to invest massively in this project and create a third way, what we have is a rump Syrian successor state comprised of probably Anbar province in Iraq and the eastern Syrian desert, with al-Qaeda affiliates or al-Qaeda main firmly in control in an area that's at the crossroads of civilization.
And that's the result today.
Well, that's one outcome.
But that's the very result of the likes of President Assad. I mean, this is the end result, no? And you want more of the same.
President Assad has actually created that which he feared. When this revolution began...
Which he feared or which he desired?
Maybe both.
Didn't he want a war on terror?
Well, let me explain. When this began, this was not a war on terror. This was about Democrats and autocrats.
It's self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
But by his actions, he has created that which he claimed, which was useful to him, but also that which he feared.
And then it leads you folks in Washington to say he is the better option.
Well, again,
so he succeeded.
I do this with great reluctance, and I describe it as the range of possible outcomes. But my point, let me finish, Marwan. But my point is that's not good. My point is this has been so badly mishandled that may be the best we can expect.
But what I'm saying, is it practical that the manufacturer of terrorism in that country, in that region, remains in power? I just see it as a pyromaniac strategy. You know, you put off the fire with more fire.
And I'm sorry, we're going to have to reverse roles here. I get to ask the question. So what's your alternative? General,
in this city, maybe you're the general. In this program, I'm the general.
But that's the practical question. What's the alternative?
You know, we probe whether you go this way or the other way. We ask the questions. Now, if I was a high-paid consultant like yours, I probably would be giving, but I don't give this administration any advice, or any other for that matter. Back to the subject of the 400 miles that are now controlled by extremists, al-Qaeda affiliates, the Islamic State, al-Nusra. This is an end result of your war in Iraq and your lack of action in Syria. Could we at least agree that there's a responsibility there?
So you're claiming this is the product of being too active in one place and not active enough in the second?
Because it's the question of how one gets involved, not whether they get involved or not get involved, correct?
Well, look, I will freely admit, all right, that one cannot consider Iraq and Syria as separate. And one of the points I'm beginning to think through now is that those lines drawn after World War I by Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, those lines don't matter the way they used to. And Marwan, at the end of this, we may see those lines go away, and we may see new political alignments in the Middle East. I mean, look, we all can agree that those lines drawn by Western powers are artificial lines. They did not reflect ethnic, religious, cultural, historical
But this
realities.
is not the way to blur them by al-Qaeda.
No, not at all. But
Because that's who, Mr. Julani is the one who's blurring them now.
Yes.
The head of al-Nusra and the head of the...
Exactly. But he's able to blur them because of historic and cultural and ethnic and religious realities on the
But
ground.
because of your
that the
occupation
lines
of Iraq.
Nah, it's not quite cause
There
and
was
effect.
no al-Qaeda in Iraq, General, before you occupied it.
Actually, there was.
I mean, there was Zarqawi, and he counted with a couple of other
Right.
with men.
Right.
But this presence,
Right.
that was created by the occupation of Iraq.
Right. And
Wars and dictatorships create extremism. Not
that's
religion.
No. That's not the only cause of extremism. And look, we had a national intelligence estimate in 2006 in which we said that Iraq had become, from al-Qaeda's point of view, the main front in the war against the far enemy, against us. And we actually said in our national intelligence estimate in 2006 that Iraq had become the cause célèbre for global jihadism.
And in 2008, you said at the Brookings Institution that this is the strategic defeat of al-Qaeda. We're seeing the end of it. 2008.
No, what I said was the strategic defeat of al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Yes.
In Iraq.
Yes, in Iraq. We're talking about Iraq.
And I actually would stand by that statement at that time.
And 5 years later, General,
And 5 years
they
later,
are occupying Fallujah.
because of
Remember
policies,
Fallujah?
I know Fallujah
The one that
very
you carpet,
well.
the one you carpet bombed.
We did not carpet bomb.
One Marine described it as Dresden of the Second World War.
I would not describe it that way.
But anyway, you bombed the heck out of that place, and now Al-Qaeda is back to occupy it. Isn't that a failure of American policy and American war policy?
It's certainly a great disappointment, but it might be caused by an
Disappointment, General, is an
inconsistency.
understatement.
Marwan, let me
It's failure
finish.
of
Let
policy.
me finish. By inconsistency in American policy. Now, you may make the claim that this got generated by the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, but it is true to say in 2008, and I don't think it's a challengeable sentence, that al-Qaeda in Iraq was facing strategic defeat. Now, what happened after 2008 was the decision of my government that the right number of American troops to remain in Iraq was zero.
So you think the problem is not that America got in, it's the problem that America got out?
I actually think that if there had been a continued American troop presence in Iraq, and not massive numbers, 7, 8, 12,000, with the right kind of people, the right kind of equipment, training, logistics, counterterrorism, intelligence, especially intelligence, that the Iraqis would have been far more able to prevent the resurgence
General,
of al-Qaeda.
You have SOFA agreements, status of forces agreements, with more than 100 countries around the world. That has not brought you more security. That has not brought the world more security.
Oh, I would.
More American soldiers in the Middle East, really?
I would,
That would bring security?
I would disagree with you. Well, wait a minute now, Marwan. I'm having trouble following the argument here. You want more American presence in Syria, otherwise it's an abdication of our moral and political responsibility?
I said there
That's
should
the
be
argument I seem to be
I said
getting.
America needs to be involved militarily in Syria. I said there is not even diplomatic pressure, political pressure. No pressures on the Russians, no pressures on the Iranians.
No, but reality.
No pressures.
but
No support to the opposition.
Pressure requires more than rhetoric. Pressure requires a willingness to do certain things.
That's true. Put America's weight. Where is it?
Well, in
I'll tell you
Syria, not very present.
There's something conspicuous, General, that Al-Qaeda is running amok in Iraq and Syria, and maybe now in Lebanon. Its affiliates all over the place, actually occupying cities. While America is going after them in the hills of Afghanistan, Pakistan, they're going after them in Somalia, in Libya, in Africa, throughout. Why is America so quiet about Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria today?
Well, we weren't quiet about al-Qaeda in Iraq. I mean, we had a
Today,
very...
today.
I understand.
Where's America?
Well, those are the products of policy decisions that are made by the current administration.
Well, I'm asking, you go after them, drones in Yemen, in Somalia. Why is this administration, why is this country conspicuously silent, not doing anything about all these extremists in Iraq and Syria? Why?
So the grand campaign using targeted killings against al-Qaeda in Pakistan actually got traction in the last year of the Bush administration. Began in about July of 2008. All right. Even then, we knew that if we were to take this course of action, that primary effect, which was the one you're describing, you're dismantling al-Qaeda, you're taking their leadership off the battlefield. That primary effect.
You're also creating more al-Qaeda members.
Well, no, hold on, I'm getting to that. Okay, that primary effect was really important. All right, we always knew that there were second and third order effects as well. Second order effects, that those kinds of actions might actually alienate some of our friends. Third order effects, that those kinds of actions might actually prove useful recruiting tools for al-Qaeda. We always knew that, all right? But our judgment in 2008 continued in 2009 and 2010, that primary effect.
I mean, doubled,
we've got
tripled, and quadrupled.
Yes, that primary effect, that we cannot allow these folks to plan attacks against us in this safe haven, dominated the calculus, dominated the consideration about taking a course of action. But those second and third order effects were always there. We are now, in my view, relatively safer here in North America from that threat from al-Qaeda prime. And so now, as you begin to think, do I still want to continue to use this tactic, this targeted killing tactic, you have to keep in mind that these second and third order effects may actually become a bit more dominant in your calculations. So the way to think about this is not an on-off switch. This is a dial, and the dial has to be carefully calibrated to the circumstances you find in each area in which you discover an al-Qaeda presence.
General, I think you're avoiding my question. Why are they carrying it out in Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and not in Iraq and Syria, where they are actually taking control of cities and they are obvious and clear to the world?
Right. Now,
why?
Now, you know, we did carry it out in Iraq, but with the absence of American forces, we can no longer do that. And we have actually...
You don't have American forces in Yemen. You don't have American forces in Pakistan.
And we don't have... You're
also violating the airspace and the sovereignty of countries.
We actually have the political circumstances in those other countries where we can act. We do not have the political circumstances in Iraq, although one of the decisions made by our government at the request of Iraq was to give the Iraqis Hellfire missiles, the very missiles that are used in the American targeted killing program.
Let's talk about that. You actually think supporting a sectarian leader, according to many Iraqis, like al-Maliki, is a solution to extremism? Once again, you're supporting an autocrat who is interested in maintaining power and who is alienating all the others, especially the Sunnis in Iraq, and you're supporting him against extremism.
Marwan, you're changing your argument here that the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq was my fault. Now you're blaming Nouri al-Maliki.
I know. I'm saying, how could supporting Nouri al-Maliki today take care of that problem when he is clearly, for the Sunnis, a Shiite sectarian leader?
Let's run the clock back. Let's go back to the fall of 2006. I'm the director of CIA. The war in Iraq looks like one of Dante's circles of hell. All right? And we're debating across the street here in the West Wing and in the old executive office building whether or not we should surge troops in Iraq. Remember the time frame, all right? I said in one of those discussions with the vice president in the room, and I'm sure it was later reported to the president, Mr. Vice President, if you put 5 brigades of sophisticated, professional, non-sectarian combat power in Iraq, it will push the violence down. That part's a given. We can make it less violent. But Mr. Vice President, that's not the ultimate objective. The ultimate objective is a stable political system. And that requires, as we push the violence down, that requires the Iraqi government to be more mature, more inclusive, more embracing of all the sectarian and ethnic groups in Iraq. And then I said, if that is to happen, Nouri al-Maliki is going to have to govern beyond his life experience. This man has spent his entire life in exile. He fears assassins at every turn. When I talk to him, when I visit Baghdad, he sees a Ba'athist behind every bush, and he thinks they're trying to kill him because for much of his life, he and his Dawa party, they were trying to kill him. That's a thin reed on which to base a political solution.
He sounds like a Saddam Hussein mindset.
Well, not quite. Certainly not quite.
Paranoid.
But it is very, very difficult for him to be the kind of leader that history demands.
So
him
you're
to
actually
be.
supporting a leader who's not inclusive, who's not a Democrat, who's not a national leader, but a sectarian leader, in order to fight extremism.
Well,
It sounds like
look.
It sounds like a trap.
One should not make the argument that we are the controlling authority as to who constitutes the government of Iraq. I mean, frankly,
I haven't even heard conditions that something say, you know what, you have to bring those parliamentarians back into parliament.
Or maybe
you have to be inclusive. Nothing.
Maybe ease the death penalty on your vice president.
For example.
Things like that. Yeah.
Nothing.
Well, actually, you've got Senator Menendez of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the U.S. Senate actually demanding that as a precondition for any increased assistance to Iraq.
Once again, the voice is coming from Congress, not from the administration.
Well, I am part of neither body of government.
Let's talk about your side of the story, the CIA and so on and so forth. You look now and throughout the region, Middle East, Africa, Asia, you see al-Qaeda proliferating almost everywhere. You think that there are different types of al-Qaeda, the ones who are hostile to the United States, the ones who are not so hostile to the United States.
Or maybe described as hostile to the United States and not yet hostile.
But they're proliferating everywhere.
Yes.
Can we recognize that this is an American failure? That the war on al-Qaeda has failed?
Well, let's parse that claim out along several levels. In terms of the immediate war, the war that we're always really good at, the actual combat, taking care of those people who are already convinced they want to come and do us harm, we've actually been remarkably successful.
Without due process?
We have due process.
Violating the sovereignties of other countries?
Due process in a war. I mean, look, our Constitution is quite clear. All right, due process is something that we give inside our internal judicial system, and it's something we give to American citizens. Now, you're going to mention Anwar al-Awlaki, and you're going to say, well, did you give that American citizen due process? And my answer would be, yes, we did. It wasn't judicial due process, but it was due process.
His son also.
Yeah, his son was not the intended victim of the strike.
A lot of unintended victims.
No, actually,
what do you call here in the city collateral damage?
We do, and it's actually
thousands of innocents.
No,
dead.
Absolutely not. And if we're talking about the targeted killing program, it's quite small and actually a remarkable testimony to the precision that the American armed forces have used.
Assassinating people overseas.
Assassinating is a narrowly defined legal term. Targeted killings of members of an armed opposing enemy force during a state of war between the United States and al-Qaeda.
Be that as it may, General, it failed, correct? It didn't deter.
No, the
al-Qaeda is
immediate
proliferating, and as you called it, a lot of groups now think it's panache to be called al-Qaeda. It's becoming fashionable.
Well, you certainly love the brand out there for some groups.
Well, you're certainly not deterring people.
Yeah.
We know that. So why continue to use the same policy, bang your head against the same wall, knowing that the result is the same? Al-Qaeda is proliferating. Maybe there should be different solutions.
All right, Marwan, we need to parse this out. There are certain tasks that needed to be done. Some of them we've done very well. Others we've not done well.
Some
we've not done at all. All right. What we've done well is to take care of that immediate man trying to kill us. All right.
I like the failures.
In American military thought, all right, we divide any conflict into what we call the close fight and the deep fight. All right. In the Cold War, the close fight was we don't want those guys invading Western Europe. The deep fight was more ideological. The deep fight was more about will communism survive? All right. In this war, the close fight is taking care of those people already convinced they want to come kill us. The deep fight deals with the production rate of those people who may want to come kill us in 1, 3, 5, or 7 years. Very successful here, not nearly as successful here. That's a much more complicated struggle for us. And we have not nearly done as much as we should have done with regard to that.
Is this your complicated way of saying we failed?
No, it's my complicated way of saying we've got more work to do.
But it's been 10 years, 12 years. And during that time, we've said so many times, we killed the second in command and we killed the second in command. We took care of that. Occupied one country, occupied another, violating the airspace and the sovereignty of this country and the other country.
I would choose different words,
We have a whole industry here. You know, the intelligence industry, the outsourcing, you know the whole bit. The surveillance program that you are the godfather of in this country, that many in this country find unconstitutional and so on and so forth. And the end result is what? The proliferation of al-Qaeda.
The end result is no successful externally based attack on the United States by al-Qaeda since 9/11. Check. That's really important. Al-Qaeda has proliferated. The Economist magazine back in September, October, stated something I believe to be very true. All right? Al-Qaeda is weaker, much weaker than it was on 9/11. But it's also true that Al-Qaeda controls more territory and has more adherents today than at any other time in its history. That's certainly true as well.
Can we agree that the main victims for Al-Qaeda might not be Americans and Westerners, but certainly the main victims of Al-Qaeda over the last 12 years have been Arabs and Muslims?
Absolutely true.
So it's okay. It's okay if Al-Qaeda proliferates out there.
No, it's not okay. But look, the solution to this deep fight, you know, the close fight, Americans can't quite handle on our own, but we can do a larger proportion of that on our own. This deep fight, it's not totally something we can't influence, but we're not the prime mover there. That requires other things to happen. Let's move on. Let's move on to Egypt. All right, and what happened there, and the Muslim Brotherhood. My last visit, one of my last visits as director, was to Cairo, and I sat there across the table from President Mubarak, and I sat there. Not unlike our conversation today, where he was throwing tough questions at me, and all those tough questions were about the lack of American understanding of Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, and all of this American pressure on him to be more inclusive and to be more democratic was a complete misreading of the situation. Well, actually, I think he got it wrong. I think we actually had a better understanding of the truth than he did. And we had a dramatic democratic revolution in Egypt, but because no other of the democratic forces were well organized, the Muslim Brotherhood came into power. Now look, Marwan, that's a very complicated situation.
But your man throughout, your interlocutor, the one, as you said it, you had a lot of time for, was Omar Slimane.
Omar, yes, of course.
Is that why you got it wrong in Egypt?
No,
you couldn't predict it?
We got it right in Egypt.
Because that was your contact?
We're the ones warning him that this cannot go on forever.
But you didn't predict that this was going to happen.
Oh, now look, this was almost spontaneous combustion. Who on earth could predict there would be 1 million people in Tahrir Square 4 weeks after a Tunisian fruit merchant self-immolates in a mid-sized Tunisian city? That's an unpredictable series of events. Those are oily rags in the corner of the room. I can tell you, Marwan, that at some point there was going to be spontaneous combustion and those rags were going to ignite.
But, you know,
that's what we were trying to tell the Egyptian government.
But you talk about spontaneous combustion. What about everything else you missed, from 9/11 to the rise of al-Qaeda again in Iraq and Syria? You know, we can go back to the 1973 war, to the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the undoing of the Soviet Union. You really got it wrong, General, on so many issues the last half a century.
We get some things right, Marwan.
But you've got a lot of important things wrong.
Okay, so you're saying I should have predicted Tahrir Square, right? Why should
I'm saying why didn't you? I'm not saying why you should have.
Why should I be any better at that than Omar Suleiman was? Omar didn't predict it either.
Because he's ideological. Presumably in this country, the intelligence community is not as politicized as in a place like Syria or Egypt.
No,
correct?
I would like to think that we're thoroughly apolitical here in the United States.
So you are political then?
No, of course we're not. We're not.
Really?
No, really. Yes, really.
So the Brotherhood has been banned in Egypt, outlawed as a terrorist organization. If you call a political group like the Brotherhood terrorists, what message does that send to the young people in the Arab world for America not to be working with the new regime in Egypt?
Yeah, my sense is that if you label the Brotherhood as terrorists, you stand a very good chance of making them terrorists. And that's not a wise decision, I believe, on the part of the Sisi government in Egypt.
But this administration is working with the Sisi leadership.
You know, life's hard, life's full of hard choices. And with whom else do you propose we work in Egypt other than the current government?
How about putting pressure on them? Ultimatums, conditions, severing support,
I am
severing any corporation. What
Marwan,
happened?
I'm out of government, all right?
You're the
I'm
superpower.
I am not privy to these conversations. I can tell you a bit about those conversations during my time as director of CIA under President Bush and with regard to his freedom agenda. And there were many instances. In fact, the reason that President Mubarak wanted to see me, all right, was to yell at me, was to complain to me about the American pressure on him to do these very kinds of things.
But so you actually think the future for a place like Egypt is a leadership that does not listen to the United States, radicalization and instability will continue, will deepen, and that will produce more of the same extremism?
I fear that if the new government in Egypt is not more inclusive and not more respectful of consistent democratic processes, we will have a low simmering insurgency by folks in Egypt against that government. And for a country that relies on tourism for much of its economic welfare, I can't think of anything more disastrous.